tools, mitigation, so you don't have to worry about that. But we do need to continue to worry about our forest health and those trees, because I don't have a good solution for that. One of the persons that people has been working on forest issues for longer than my career in extension is my friend Tony Cheng. Tony and I met each other when the Colorado Barkfield Cooperative was getting going in the early 2000s. I was doing work for Senator Bennett. Tony was doing work for Colorado State University. He's a professor in the Department of Rangeland and Forest Stewardship in the Warner College of Natural Resources at CSU. I'm fortunate enough to call him an extension colleague, but most importantly, he is the director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at CSU. And I'm thrilled to have someone of his caliber, knowledge, and friendship, I guess we'd all say, at Routt County. Have Tony close us out this afternoon. So Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks and welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the council organizing committee for putting this on. I know this is always a big effort, and for all of you to take that Saturday morning, I'm not sure I would even be here. This is like my thing, and I would have a hard time spending the mornings here. And the fact that you're here means that you're very committed, and it's very important to you. And your community leaders, you are early adopters and innovators in this field. So as Todd mentioned, I'm on the faculty in Forest and Rangeland Stewardship program at Colorado State University. I have an extension appointment. And I manifest that appointment through two applied research and outreach organizations. One's called the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. Another is the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. CFRI is one of three such institutes. We were chartered through an act of Congress in 2004, following those really gnarly fire years in 2000, 2002. Those were real wake-up calls for a lot of folks, especially out just across the West, from Montana, Oregon, all the way down through Arizona, to Mexico and Colorado. We have very large fires here, and these institutes were set up to really accelerate the deployment of science into management decision-making, because a lot of work that was going on, especially in the forestry world, really didn't account for these kinds of fires. And now we're seeing those on a regular basis. The Southern Rockies Fire Science Network is one of 16 what we call fire science exchanges. It's very much a type of extension program where we have resources through the Joint Fire Science Program, which is an interagency federal research program, where we can help host events like this. So as you continue down the road and you want to maybe do some more engagement with your neighbors, maybe with neighboring counties, those are opportunities that are also available. So I was asked to wrap this up, and then I was also asked to send my PowerPoint last Monday. So hopefully the wrap up from last Monday matches the wrap up for today. And you're going to hear a lot of common themes. And as I was sitting here this morning, one of the things that impressed me with Routt County is just how many of your jurisdictional representatives, where your tax dollars go, are actually doing this work. And so you already have a huge base of work. You all here are here. That's another foundation to work on, all the ideas and those kinds of things. And you have a lot of great resources. And so my title is really about coexisting with wildfire adjacent community. It's really about bringing it back to this bigger picture, what it means, why are you here, why do you live here, why do you work here, you're choosing to make a living here, raise a family here. Any of us can probably go to a lot of different places and do the same thing, but you're here. Wildfire, as you now know, is now a part of our realities, and we are the realities of fire. I think Sam really articulated really well in the first panel, is that we're seeing fire in ways that no one has ever predicted, experienced. The science isn't even catching up to it yet. And so the firefighters on the ground, what they're seeing in terms of fire behavior from December all the way into December is something that we don't even understand. And we don't, our management system, right, our fire risk management systems are not set up for this. And so we are creating this system right now. And I think what you're hearing is that you're hearing your risk management partners from the forest side to your community to your emergency management partners is that they can't do it alone anymore. We are a society that has outsourced a lot of our risk. And now it's time for us to take it back. Okay? So that's kind of one thing that I want you to leave here. And with your neighbors, we need to take back your that outsourcing, and we need to own it. Everybody needs to own it. Okay, so this is my presentation. I interact with a lot of 18 to 22-year-olds in my class, so I always have to say, this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to remind you what I talked about. Okay. Oops. All right. So this is just a stage share, and again, it's just kind of a recap. And I want to introduce this notion of the piracy. This morning, Colleen Haskell talked about that we don't just have a fire season anymore, we have a fire year. And I want to introduce this notion that we are in an era of fire. Stephen Pine is a historian. He was at Arizona State University. One of the most eloquent, prolific historians of fire in this country. And he has a whole compendium of writings, and this is his latest work, and talks about how we are living in an era of fire that we have created. Okay, so it's a man-made era, similar to a lot of people are talking about the Anthropocene and how human activity is really driving climate. Okay, so that's sort of one interesting read, and provides a lot of context to say we are living in an era of fire. We need to live with it, and so that's what it comes to coexist. This is a graphic that just kind of articulates what everybody's already been saying. There are this is what's called the fire occurrence triangle. So John Twitchell talked about the fire triangle, the fire behavior triangle, and this is what's called the fire occurrence or fire regime triangle. And so there's three drivers of when a fire and where it might occur. You have your atmospheric conditions, and resources to burn. It's pretty simple. We can model it, we can empirically predict it. All the factors that are driving fire occurrence are increasing. Okay. So we've already heard that from the atmospheric side, from Colleen. We've heard it from everybody that was talking about resource to burn. And we haven't talked too much about emissions. Before you leave, you know, look at the map. There's one over here to my right, and then one in the back. It shows the fire perimeters. It also shows your ignitions. We have a lot of ignitions, and we're going to see more. Okay. Out on the front range, we have seen. I live in Fort Collins, Colorado. We have seen a 40% increase in recreation visitation of public lands. And every single one of those large fires we experienced in 2020 were human ignitions. Every single one. And so that's something we control, right? That's a human behavior thing. There's a lot of other things. Actually, you could argue we can control all of these, but some of them are more immediate within our control. We also heard about the fire behavior triangle, where you have topography, weather, and fuel, where again we're seeing atmospheric conditions. This notion of the EEI is called the atmospheric thirst quotient. The atmosphere right now is literally pulling moisture out of the earth because it's so dry. And these are manifestations of climate change. And so we have more days. There's an index that atmospheric fire science people use called the Haynes index. 6 is one of the highest indices. We're seeing more days with Haynes index of 6 than we have ever seen in the last however long they've been measuring these indices. So we're seeing rapid fire growth, all these kinds of things. So we know this, but there's also a lot of science behind it. And that's a big part of the role of our organization, is to be not only develop science, but to be an aggregator of it, and then drive it into local communities so they know what to do with that science, right? So that it means something. So what we're seeing then is very different kinds of fire conditions and fire behavior. And again, you've heard people that have worked fire lines, seeing conditions. And as a result, we're seeing changes in how wildland fire is approaching fire, with much more what we call indirect fire rather than direct, because of, especially in this part of the world where you have a lot of your insect outbreaks, your mountain pine beetle, your spruce beetle is now creating a lot of deadfall. That creates a very it's a hazard for firefighters to get in, and so it's dangerous for fire operators to get into those fire areas. So we're seeing a lot of not seeing as much indirect. We're seeing a lot more of these what we call pyrocumulus cloud formations, where the energy that is being released. So this is a high Haynes index day. This is taken off of Twitter. This is a commercial airline pilot that's flying at 30,000 feet. Look how much higher that plume is. One way I think about it is, if you think about what's burning there, the trees, the plant material, this is the accumulation of solar energy, right? All that photosynthesis is releasing the power of the sun right there. And that's a lot of energy. And at that point, there's not a whole lot that wildland firefighters can do about it. And we want to keep them safe. This is the Williamsburg fire, which is one of the smaller fires in 2020. That's one we heard a lot about embers. We're seeing embers have always been a part of fire, but this is a graphic of from the campfire in Paradise on the right. John Twitchell talked about that. That is what we call an ember assault. It's an enormous amount. And what happens, and fire physicists are now seeing, what happens is that homes, when winds hit that, it basically accelerates wind around the side, and we're actually seeing a lot of accumulation of embers happens on the lee side where you have these wind days. So it's not just your prevailing winds, it's actually also happening, and they start piling up. In the Waldo Canyon fire that burned in 2012 in Colorado Springs, firefighters were scraping away ember buildups of like 8 inches up against the house. Yeah.
Are you saying that the fire kind of creates a microclimate that creates different wind patterns, so the larger wind patterns?
So fire does create its own weather, like this pyrocumulus, but as you're seeing, and it creates its own wind. Right? So it creates a low pressure system on the downwind side that then takes oxygen and brings it back into the fire. That's how we create these plumes. And then the plume hits the jet stream, cools down, and then collapses. And when you see the plumes collapse, get out of the way, and that's when you see a lot of these ember assaults, right? Because then you're seeing this stuff like, I don't know if you guys saw this. Flaming pine cones traveling like 2 miles from collapsing plumes. So we're not seeing just fire fronts. Fire, big wildland fires, what we're seeing is just hopping and skipping, and there is no front. There's multiple fires burning at the same time. Okay. Don't want to freak you out. But I want you also to appreciate the risk that these wildland firefighters are doing every day in these kinds of things. So, and they're poorly paid. They don't, a lot of times they don't have health insurance, and they are literally an underserved community within our population. There's a question.
What was actually your statement about that lower against the house? What struck me that it's very concerning is that you're seeing currents that are pushing up embers. You're pushing up the embers against the leeward side of the house. And so that's also now lower part of the house. So I was just thinking, I need to stress protecting the windward side of the house, but now we need to be protecting all sections of the house because we're getting it's that currents that are pushing the embers up against the
Yeah, and so what's happening at the macro scale with, you know, mountain ranges and those kinds of things, it's happening at the micro scale, even like fence posts. Fence post curriculum is behind there, you'll see a lot of nodding from the fire chief here. You'll see embers piling up on the leeward side of fence posts. So when Jack Cohen was doing his initial experiments, he was doing it in a warehouse. And so he would build the siding of a house and he would like set up a bunch of fields. He was lighting on fire. And what he was trying to measure was how long the radiant heat from a flame would catch a siding on fire. And what was happening was the radiant heat wasn't catching the siding on fire, it was the embers. And so he would keep failing his experiment because the embers were the ones that were catching. And then that's what hit him. It wasn't the radiant heat of flame in front, it was the embers. And then as we've been able to do more modeling and all that kind of work, yeah, small little devices will curl around. And you know, you've probably experienced that, right? You know, just in wind events and all these kind of curling around, right?
So Tony, the only thing is that, like, maybe you said the windward side, yeah, up and down to the west and so forth, but during a fire or during a weather event, prevailing wind could be from a thunderstorm or something else. So consider any side of your house as potentially leeward and windward side.
Yeah, exactly. And also, we also have, I don't know if you experience this if you're out here, but on the front range, right, we have, in the summertime, the plains heat up, right? And so we have these winds that start actually blowing against the prevailing wind. And then as it cools down, the wind starts downslope. And so you can have winds coming out actually from anywhere that's driving a fire, even downhill, against the prevailing winds because of that downward nighttime cooling. And because we're that atmospheric, you know, kind of drawing up of that, of the moisture, we're not even getting those higher relative humidities that night. We're seeing relative humidities not even changing. I don't know if you're experiencing that out here, but we're certainly experiencing that in a lot of other places. And that's when firefighters historically thought they'd be purchased on a fire. It was that night, right? Great back burns, and big line, you've got 4 or 5 months. You don't see that. Okay. All right. So how do we what does it even mean to coexist with a situation like this? So one is just getting in a mindset that we're living in an era of fire, and the kinds of fires that we are more likely to experience are going to be large growth, and that are going to exceed the resources of our wildland firefighting services, unless we agree to raise our taxes and provide the chief with more resources. Quite honest. So I want to introduce the notion of a portfolio approach, and we kind of danced around this today and in the last 2 days for those of you that have been around. So I want you to digest this imagery. This is from an organization called Headwaters Economics. They're in Bozeman, Montana. They're a nonprofit organization, do a lot of applied research on a variety of topics. They have this great wildland fire, community wildfire program. Love the work. But this could be any community. This could be your community, right? Just look at that cartoon of it, and this is your community, right? Todd introduced today that everybody in the community is affected by fire, even if your home didn't ignite and burn. We are all affected when a fire comes into proximity. So you have the wildlands, right? The quote unquote wildlands, where you have your forests. You also have your critical watersheds, right? I think 90% of Steve O Springs' water supplies comes from Fall Creek. What? Fish Creek. What happens when that creek burns up and you have an erosion and sediment load that exceeds the capacity of those intake facilities? You shut it down. That's what happened in Denver Water in 2002. That's what happened in my water supply during the High Park and Cameron Peak. 40% of my city's water comes from the Crude River, and they have to shut it off. And because they have redundancy in their system, I didn't see it break the surface. You don't have redundancy in your system. Still Colorado is shipping water because their only water supply is out of Colorado River. Every time a storm comes in and dumps rain into the Grizzly Creek fire, all that sediment load comes in and overwhelms the intake system. So your house doesn't have to burn down for you to be affected by fire. Your power lines, okay, communication towers. So we have a portfolio, right? You have a range of what we call highly valued resources and assets. And this is a term that in risk management, we're using a lot to be able to identify and map on the landscape. So we talk about HVRA, highly valued resources and assets. Each HVRA has a type of resilience, has the ability to receive and recover from fire. The lodgepole pine forests have high resilience. They could take enormous amounts of heat and fire and recover. In fact, they're evolutionarily adapted. We, not so much, right? It doesn't take a lot of flame length to harm a human being. Okay? And so we calculate those two things, and then we can map it on the landscape. So mitigation is about increasing every HVRA in your portfolio in that map to resilience. Not just before, we're talking about mitigation, but also during. And we talked a lot about evacuation and those kinds of stuff. But one thing you haven't talked about, maybe this is for a future conference, after fire. And I think if your friends down south in Grant County are dealing with a lot of post-fire, and there's not a lot of resources from the federal government that comes in to sustain the kinds of costs that local communities have to bear after the fire. And I have colleagues in Arizona after the Schultz fire have estimated that the Schultz fire in 2010 cost about, I think it was about $35 million to suppress and do like some initial post-fire recovery. In the 12 years since the Schultz fire, it has cost that community $168 million in recovery costs. Every time there's a rainstorm and it fills up a culvert, who has to report? Who has to deal with it? It's the county, right? Every time a road has to close, it's at an economic cost. Club 20 did an analysis of the daily cost of shutting down I-70 as a result of the Grizzly Creek fire, the post-fire flooding. It was something on the order of $64 million a day to Western Colorado. So these are real, right? These are real costs borne by real people. The businesses in Grand Junction are not open because they weren't getting their supplies because I-70 is closed. Okay. What happens if Highway 40 closes as a result of a fire and you have cash shelter play? Right, so we don't think about this. We have been cultured to think about wildfire and fire risk to our own properties, and that's important. That's a big part of what you're talking about today. Just want to introduce, there's a portfolio of risks that we all have to recognize. Even if you don't have direct control over it, you have to recognize that this is part of your portfolio of risk. Okay. So every one of us has a action to take to mitigate and to increase resilience. The more you can coordinate those actions, the more resilient that entire portfolio is. And it's not just about homes. So that's another thing I want to leave you with. We have the wildland urban interface, the WUI, has become a lexicon in our vocabulary. And we have this mental model that it's that string of homes that abut the vegetation. And it's no longer that, right? The kinds of fires we're seeing, it impacts this entire portfolio from the headwaters all the way to downtown. All right, so again, working pre-fire, coordinating your mitigation actions, doing everything you can to make every one of those HPRs resilient. During a fire, right, giving your emergency responders the room to operate, not burdening their already taxed systems, and then after the fire. So that might, again, I will suggest that one of your next events is to think about post-fire and how do you become resilient to post-fire issues. On my drive, and I'll drive back tomorrow from this event, I'll drive down Cooper River Canyon, and there are big yellow machines on the road on Highway 14 that are cleaning out debris from a very small rain event that happened last week. We're not even in monsoon season. All right, now you have this picture, right? This mental picture of your portfolio. How do you actually translate that? One of the most powerful things that we have now at our disposal is a variety of mapping tools, right? Geographic information systems, computerized mapping tools that you can integrate high resolution fire analytics with local knowledge, right? So we can map your high value resources and assets. We can pair them against high powered, high resolution fire analytics in terms of fire probability, fire growth, fire behavior, those kinds of things. And we can start assigning judgments about how resilient different HPRAs are. And it's not some analyst in some basement in some federal building. It's you all here that sit around the table around maps. And that's part of your actual principles of your community wildfire protection plan. If you've read one of the posters out there. It's really identifying your own values, how exposed you are to fire, and what you can do about it, and then prioritizing your actions accordingly. So here's an example, and those of you who heard yesterday heard from Commissioner Greg Feld, who's the Commissioner for Routt County, and they went through this process using these kind of GIS-based analytics, but gathered around maps. And then held community meetings, went out in the field to ground truth to localize that knowledge. And what you're seeing is, this is just an example of what you could do. What you're seeing is a prioritization of where they would do not just defensible space, but really do landscape scale fuels reduction management. This is a high, and then we were able to do some economic analysis where what would you do with your first $1 million and how much risk would it reduce? So we can actually quantify the investment and the return on investment in terms of the amount of risk that we reduce. Okay, and then so the first place you would go would be the deep red. And then as soon as you got through that, if you had other resources, then you would go to kind of that orange and so on and so forth. And you get to this point where you can talk about that with actually a fairly minimal investment, you can reduce liability risk. And from their calculations, they can treat about 5% of the at-risk acres and achieve a 50% reduction in risk in terms of fire hazard when it gets into the wildland. It's pretty significant. Doesn't mean that homes won't burn down. And more homes burn from grass fires than forest fires, right? So again, our mental model of like home ignition and home risk, thousands of homes, entire communities have burned down grass fires. Right? Malden, Washington, where I grew up, about 30 miles from my hometown, entire community burned down in grass fire. There's grass fires going on in Nebraska and southeastern Colorado. Communities are and get like that. So it's not just the trees. The trees are important. We love trees, but it's also all the other stuff that catch fire, like Jack said. Right. Swim right. Yeah. So this is something that the community can do, right? So the county now owns this data set. They're using it to drive planning. They're using it to drive even land use planning and building. Because now they know where they're bringing risks. They know where to go. Another great mapping tool that my organization used, and I know that a few of the Wildfire folks have been using in this community, it's something that I think this community, every community needs to know, is something called PODS, potential operational delineations. This is an opportunity for all wildland fire and emergency responders to get the knowledge that they have and the experience that they have in their heads and put it on a map, and then jointly plan about where those potential opportunities are for effective control in the event of a wildland fire under different conditions. So again, this is a great opportunity for community organizations to take part in identifying where those values at risk are, where are those opportunities to manage fires in more productive and safe ways. So again, it combines a variety of high power analytics, but also local knowledge. Again, there could be an analyst sitting in the basement of a federal building that can develop your pods, but it's much more powerful when it becomes a community and participatory approach. And so this is an example of the pods map in my neck of the woods in the Rapid Roosevelt National Forest. This is the town of Fort Collins. Right down here, there's a Hyde Park fire, and these are the pod boundaries. And when we actually did a post-fire analysis of the Cameron Peak fire, the fire responses were almost aligned exactly to the pod boundaries. They were extremely useful and effective for wildland firefighters in that event. Again, coordinated mitigation strategies are meaningful and actionable only when all the entities participate in collaborative development strategies. That's why this council is here, and that's why we're having this workshop. And again, we really try to emphasize that as we bring pods into local communities and regions to make sure that it's not just a handful of people, but the kind of communication that's facilitated is really important. In fact, the communication and relationships that are created during the development of pods, it may be as more important than the final map. So you can ask a whole bunch of questions as a result of doing your pod maps. So a map isn't a plan. A map is just possibilities. Yeah, it's just a map. So what you then need to take is then looking at that map, who has authority and jurisdiction over what action where, right? And then you start to create a strategy, and that's what community wildfire protection plan is. So you identify what those actions are, where they're going to occur, what are the conditions under which those actions are meant to be effective. At some point, you can do all kinds of mitigation action. A colleague of mine, talks about that basically it's a fulcrum of risk. So wildland fire creates an enormous amount of risk burden on your routes and assets, and every intervention you take can create leverage against that risk. But it's hard to gain complete leverage because these are like natural systems and natural forces. So everything you do together as a community creates leverage against that goal. And then a plan is who's responsible. What's the resources it's going to take? What are your indicators of success? How do you know when to move on from one step to the next? Because you keep doing stuff and keep going to meetings, even when it doesn't make sense to keep going to those meetings. So this is an example of a strategy that we're starting to put together for the Northern Front Range through what's called the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative, where again we identify who has what authority to do what kinds of actions before, during, and after. Starts aligning, right? So now everybody knows who's doing what, who to call, where to go for resources. So you go through that mental model, right? The idea that you have a portfolio risk, and then you got to do something with that. right? You gotta sit around, roll up your sleeves, sit around maps, identify where those values are, using those analytics to know where your fire risk is. Start driving priorities through maps, then plans, and then those plans can start tracking resources when you can actually get work on it. So in the Chaffey County model, and those of you again who were here yesterday, up to this point, they have taken about $1.4 million of their own community money and have basically grown it by a quarter of that in like 2 years. Success begets success. And one of the things that is happening at the federal level is there's the bipartisan infrastructure law that has allocated about $3.4 billion for wildland fire risk mitigation on federal lands, but also communities. And that funding is going to come down through our federal partners, through the Forest Service, and it's going to drive all the way to the ground. And your state forester, Matt Combs, said that the communities that are ready to capture these resources that are ready with these plans are going to be the ones that are going to be able to capture these resources. So that's why there's a little bit of a kind of a time stamp on this. We're going to get this going because once that pipe starts opening up, there's funding that's going to hit the ground, and the communities that have a plan, they're going to get it. If the communities that don't have a plan are going to have a plan imposed on them, and you want to be one of those communities. So thank you. Questions, discussion, or are you just ready to go?
I'm sure that given all the great information Tony's giving you, that there are some questions or comments out here in the audience. Get out of 10. Okay, all right.
So Tony, you've been here the last couple of days, from a scale of 1 to 10, where do we stand right now?
I think you're about a 4. You're about 4 in readiness. Because you already have, you have a lot of people that have done a lot of mapping, have a lot of these things, but I think they're in different places, right? So one exercise, we were talking about this last night, is just bringing it all together, having some dedicated people then to and they can work with us or any of the other federal partners that have access to these like, it's such a stupid term, but these high resolution fire analytics. Once you have those, then it's just you all making the time to take what's in your head in terms of what's your values, where are those values, take the knowledge that's in your firefighters' heads about what are they seeing in terms of fire behavior and fire occurrence, because all of those analytics, they're drawing from these off-the-shelf databases. Now, these off-the-shelf databases, somebody literally, I don't want to say they made them up, but they kind of just made them up. Right? Because we don't know. The only people who know about what's going on with fire in your places are the people that are working the fire in your place. So you got to get them in the room with you all and have them download that from your brains onto those mapping products. You can do that like next month. And then you translate those maps into a plan where you start assigning people who's going to do what, where, under what conditions is going to be successful. And when you have that, I've been talking to a lot of people from Washington, D.C., all the way down to the regional office of Forest Service. If you have all of that, you have a community that's ready, you have metrics of success, and you have a plan for using that money, that's what they're looking for. There is, I don't want to exaggerate, there is so much money coming through the system that the system can't absorb because the system is not set up to deal with these kinds of problems.
Next question here.
Yeah, Tony, maybe this may not be the best place or even time to ask this question, but we've had some discussions along these lines. So the last couple of days, we've been talking about fire. And that's, we're meeting the moment. That's what's happening right now. Where does like the broader ecosystem services fall into the HVRA and I know there's overlap. I guess my only point, and I think you and I may have spoken about this over beer at some point, but, you know, philosophically as a forester, right now there's this phrase called random acts of conservation, and it's meant to say we really need to focus on the problem and not do things in other places. But on the other hand, we have a lot of values that we get from the forest. So there's no real, it's not a black and white answer, but if you wanted to just comment on, it's a philosophical question almost.
It is a philosophical question, but I think again, if you think about those portfolio of values in your community that interact with fire, and what makes those, why are they highly valued? It may not just be your home, right? It's the fact that from here, you could get on a bike and be in some of the most fabulous aspen forests in North America. That's why a lot of people are here. And if you lose those, right? I mean, that's the value are those assets. And so I think there's an opportunity to take that philosophical orientation and kind of see how it maps into your HDRA. Right, and so there may be, I mean, there may be pockets of like, you know, there's a lot of concern about losing old growth forests. There may be still like remnant areas of old growth spruce, fir, and those kinds of things that are like biological heritages that are important for a whole variety of reasons. If those things burn down, they're gone for like 600 years. What's more irreplaceable, right? And so I think those are ways when we so focus, if you really want to drive, if you want to gain as much leverage as you can on that fulcrum around fire, I can tell you exactly what to do. Clear cut your forest and put gravel on it. And is that, anybody want to argue with me? And is that a community you want to live in? Yeah. And so I think those are things, right? And so that's kind of one of those things where if you have those discussions and you know that, you know, all fuel is trees, plants, all stuff that makes this a great place. And if you, and there may be a limit to the leverage that you want to create in terms of reducing that fire risk, because you want to keep that, you want to keep those forests in the way they were meant to be. That means then there's more to do on the community side to gain that leverage, because those forests want to burn, right? That's a hard thing for us to hear. Those forests want to burn. If they didn't burn, they wouldn't be the forests they are here. They burned a lot in the late 1800s. We took a lot of that ignition source off the land. The indigenous peoples that lived in this area for 15,000 years that used fire to shape these landscapes. We took them out, and then we took fire out. These forests want to burn. So coexisting with that fact and knowing that that's a value that you all want to have, I think that kind of gets to that, right? There's only there's a limit. And then we want to do forest management for a variety of reasons that are outside of fire, right? For wildlife habitat, for sustainable forestry, for carbon sequestration. Yeah. So I worry too that we kind of have hemmed in this conversation just to talk about fire risk, and we're losing sight of the larger conservation strategy. So the more you have those kinds of conversations to integrate long-term conservation and ecosystem resilience with kind of the short-term fire, I think you will be so much further ahead of just about every community in North America.
So Tony, put you on the spot a little bit. This community is.
Is it needs to be recorded? Is that just to make sure it's on?
So you know, this community is just starting to update its CPP, and you know it's going to take a lot of effort, and you have a huge amount of expertise. And we're wondering if you can support us, and we send our information out to you, or is there a way to get you involved this community's CWPP, so we can have the data that you were talking about.
So my answer is yes, but let's keep talking about what that looks like. I think one of the things that I in my organization, leadership team, we talk a lot about is that this Cheng County model has, you know, we were learning with the county commissioners and their partners as they were doing it. And we had no idea how powerful a tool that mapping process and the resulting CFP could be. And now they're kind of taking off. We're getting a lot more demand for that because a lot of communities are seeing the success of that. And we are, because we're a university, we can give people the fish, or we can teach you to fish. I'd much rather teach you to fish. And I think you have an enormous amount of resources in this community that are ready. I see a lot of those, you know, whatever tubes sitting on top of, you already have a lot of fish. People that know how to fish. And so let's talk about what that might look like. Because again, we're looking for these kind of pilots for communities that are at a stage of readiness that can absorb this and then just take it. We don't own it. We don't have any. We're a public education organization that serves the public, right? My salary comes from taxpayers. I work for you, and so the work that we do then automatically deliver back to you for you to own. Okay? And so we talked about potentially interacting with Colorado College and the GS program. I think it's low hanging fruit, and I think it could be a real, you know, a new. So then Chafee becomes really jealous of Routt.
Brilliantly played, Tony, brilliantly played.